manager at community, and run the newsletter and bits of the website and support the directors. To move on, these are just a few of our community energy groups. The map shows our current spread of membership groups. The groups are involved in all sorts of different things, but just a few of them. We've got Sustainable Overton here, who are a new group who have been mentored through our Pathways programme, who've now trained up 7 energy champions to conduct fuel poverty and climate outreach in their community, and just about to launch their own share offer. And then we have on the other side, Energise Sussex Coast, for example, who've been established for 10 years and a speciality in fuel poverty outreach, and have been doing great things in Hastings and around their surrounding area. But we now have 54 member groups across the southeast up into Essex, all the way down as far as the Isle of Wight, and growing all the time. Community energy partnerships are really important to us. We partner with key people, Community Energy South, with SGN, UK Power Networks, the county councils, in order to build relationships to support the community energy section and build that from within these communities. We've worked with the Regional Energy Hub to embed community energy strategies in their regional energy strategies, so to just keep that at the forefront of people's minds. And our key projects at the moment are our Pathways, which are mentoring community energy groups from nothing up to funding bits across Hampshire, Essex, South Downs, and soon more to be announced in the next couple of weeks. We like to share best practice across these and support these groups to become self-sufficient and create a network across the country. And finally, we are also involved in one of the last Euro-funded projects called the Eastern New Energy Project, and the Southeastern New Energy Project is just about to kick off as well. We again supporting the community energy sector across here. Before I pass back to Liz, just to briefly say, do get involved. You can register for our newsletter, you can join these masterclasses, you can talk to us about becoming a partner organisation. Let's keep it at the forefront of people's minds and drive forward community energy and looking to support everybody in tackling climate change, fuel poverty, and moving forward. As I said, I'm trying to be very brief so I don't take up too much of anyone's time. So I'll pass back to you now, Liz.
Thank you so much, Jessie. I see we've got more people arriving, so I'm going to, before I introduce our next speaker, I just want to encourage the new people who've arrived just to mark where you're from in your name by renaming yourself. So if you hover your mouse over the top right-hand corner of your video screen, you'll see 3 little white buttons. You can click on those 3 white buttons and find rename, and just add at the end of your name where you're from. So we've got someone from Lewis, we've got quite a few from Lewis, we've got Marlow and Overton. It's just good to find out. You might find you've got neighbours who are also on this session and you didn't even realise they shared interests. So it's really helpful to name where you're from. And secondly, before I hand over to our next speaker, do feel free to put loads of questions in the chat box. We've got Jessie, Colin, Michael from CES, and I will all be keeping an eye on the chat box. So we'll have our 2 speakers and then we will open it up to questions. And one of the ways we do it is people put the questions in the chat box. So if they get missed or if there isn't time to answer them all in the session, we might be able to answer them later. So welcome everyone, it's lovely to see so many people here. I'm now going to hand over to Colin Nolden, who I can't actually see, oh there you are Colin, who is another Community Energy South Director, but also an expert in fuel poverty and energy efficiency. Colin, I'm going to leave you now to speak about yourself. And to give your presentation.
Hello, I hope you can hear me. Just give me a thumbs up. Excellent. So My name is Colin Alden, and I'm one of the Community Energy South directors. I just want to make sure you can actually see my see the correct screen. Are you actually seeing my presentation or the?
No, we can see half of your presentation and half of your notes.
Okay. Is this better?
Yes, that's it.
Excellent. Right. So as Liz mentioned, I'm one of the directors of Community Energy South, but I also work at the University of Bristol and the University of Oxford. And with the help of funding from the Economic and Social Research Council, I was able to undertake some research last year using the company fuel poverty data from South East London Community Energy and from Energise Sussex Coast. And I believe there is people from both organisations attending today's seminar. So just some background, there was a very interesting report published last month by the Committee on Fuel Poverty, suggesting that fuel poverty has fallen quite significantly since the Committee on Fuel Poverty was formed in 2016 from 4.35 million people to 3.18. At the same time, the report highlights that only around 0.4 billion of the 2.55 billion allocated to improving energy efficiency and assisting householders pay their energy bills is received by the fuel poor. So which suggests that these funding sources are skewed towards people who are not fuel poor, which is a shame. And it also highlights that there's a lack of a centralized database, which implies that the addresses of fuel poor households are unknown, which complicates targeted assistance. And that's something that would be very familiar to the organizations engaging in fuel poverty alleviation at a community level. So these are among the issues faced by many Community Energy South member groups, as well as groups around the country. And I'm just going to provide you with some information about fuel poverty trends, which are quite interesting across these two member groups. So first of all, South East London Community Energy and Energise Sussex Coast. They're in rather different geographical areas. So South East London Community Energy is in a very urban setting. And as you can see from these from these demographic bars here, this is a range of customers. This was from a data set from 2018, which indicates that their customer range is between about 30 and 60. Whereas the data on the right, which is slightly different age numbers, age ranges, suggests that the customer range of Energise Sussex Coast is generally an older demographic, which also reflects the demographic of the geographical areas where Energise Sussex Coast targets Hastings and the surrounding areas, and South East London Community Energy, the area around Greenwich. So there's slightly different demographics in these two areas. And there is quite a different ethnic composition of their customers. So on the left, we have South East London Community Energy with, a fairly large share of English, Welsh, Scottish, Northern Irish and British customers, but then a very wide range of people from a huge range of cultures. Whereas on the right, we can see that the customers of Energise Sussex Coast are predominantly English, Welsh, Scottish, Northern Irish, British, so white people, which also reflects the local demographic. Now, despite the different age composition and the different ethnicity of the clients, we actually find quite similar trends when it comes to switching. Now, supplier switching is supported by several funders, and it is the most continuous data sets that I have. So I was able to create these timelines between 2050 and 20.
Colin, can I just interrupt you for a moment and ask you to switch off your personal video because your audio keeps fading out. So maybe if you switch off your video, we'll hear you a little better. Thank you.
Okay, maybe if I sit a bit closer, maybe that's better. Is that better?
Well, it is at the moment. I'm not sure if it's internet or you, but try with it without your video on and see if that helps. Thank you. Sorry to interrupt.
So what we can see here now are these trend lines that I created out of the data provided by South East London Community Energy and by Energise Sussex Coast. And what we see here is this is the trend in terms of advice provided on the day regarding switching. So these were clients that were switched to another supplier following advice by these community energy groups. The blue line shows the percentage of clients that were switched. And so these periods, they cover the winter periods. So in this case, we have the winter periods between 2015, 16 and 2020 and 21. And this is the period between October and March. And what we can see in both cases, that in 2015 and 2016, the share of people that were switched to a better deal was higher than in the following years. But what we can see now is in recent years, in 2019, 20 and in 2021, a greater share of clients have been switched to better deals. In London, the actual savings have been declining since 2018, but in Hastings, we haven't seen much of a change. What we can see here is that by switching people on poor value deals to better deals can save, in these cases, between about 150 and 200 pounds. Of course, with the recent trends in the spike of gas prices, a lot of these opportunities to save money on electricity bills has fallen by the wayside. So the question is now whether this remains an option in the future to save people some money by switching. The other trend line I have created, let's see, is regarding the warm home discounts. Now, warm home discounts, there are several people who can apply for warm home discounts. These are people who fall below a certain income threshold. And what we can see here of particular interest is here the blue line. So on the right, we have from Energise Sussex Coast, we have the percentage of clients which applied for a warm home discount as part of the advice that they received. And we can see in recent years, a very steep increase in the percentage of clients who applied for warm home discounts, which suggests that the eligibility for warm home discounts is increasing. And we see a similar trend on the left-hand side for South East London Community Energy. In this case, the percentage of people who actually apply for warm home discount, which is the red line at the bottom, has decreased. But in terms of eligibility, we see a very steep increase from 2018-19. So over 50% of the clients that South East London Community Energy engaged with last winter were eligible for warm home discounts, which is up from about 9% in 2018-2019. This points towards a significant increase in eligibility, which probably has something to do with the COVID-19 crisis. As part of a different project, I also gathered some data among energy experts here in the UK. I've had 80 responses, and we asked these energy experts what the key determinant is for individuals to benefit from UK energy policy. And what we can see here is that home ownership and affluence are considered the main determinants for somebody to actually benefit from UK energy policy, which is also reflected with the figures that I mentioned early on, where only 0.4 billion of the 2.55 billion available to support homeowners actually benefit the fewer poor. So just to conclude, what needs to change to support community fuel poverty alleviation efforts? So what we found by analysing the data is that all the different funders, such as the Big Energy Saving Network, British Gas Energy Trust and so on. They all have different data capturing tools and systems. So what would be really helpful would be a single data capturing and management tool, as well as a centralized database for all organizations working on energy poverty alleviation. And I know that Brenda has been arguing for this for 30 years. What we also need is better data gathering, management and analysis support to help fuel poverty alleviating organizations capture their input and follow up on their output. Because a lot of what the community energy organizations such as South East London Community Energy and Energize Sussex Coast do and achieve actually happens after the advice, and they've no means to actually capturing this. So if they had better analysis support and so on, they would have a better understanding of who, where, and when has benefited, and how this has affected the journey from people out of fuel poverty. Furthermore, more consistent funding which builds on evidence is necessary. Just yesterday evening, Richard sent Brenda and me another email pointing towards the difficulty of getting sustained funding, which extends beyond the winter period between October and March. And I'm sure most of your organizations here attending will be facing similar issues. And finally, better coordination is required with efforts to improve the housing stock. This is what Brenda will be talking about in her presentation. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Colin. I don't think we will, I have a couple of questions that came out of there, but I think before we go over to questions, I think we should hand over to Brenda, who, as you say, will talk about the coordination needed.
Liz, you're cutting out now as well.
I'll hand over to you then, Jessie. Are you all right to coordinate this now?
Liz, you were cutting out. Should I then,
Do you want to take over, Colin?
Yes, I would.
I'm going to switch my video off to try and cut down on what's being used.
Yes, so it is my honor to introduce Brenda Boardman, who is a colleague of mine at Poverty. She invented, which was there anyway, but she brought it into the sphere, and she has published several books on this topic. She's also played a very important role in setting standards such as the University of Oxford and the University of Exeter, and I really look forward to her presentation now. Brenda, the digital floor is yours.
Colin, I can see at least one is not muted, so can I just ask everybody to make sure they're muted? It's Jill Hickman from New Forest that I can see isn't at the moment, and I thought I could hear some background noises. Anyway, I'm extremely excited to be here today, and I hope that it's going to be a useful session for you. I'm sharing my screen if I can. Now, Colin, does that work? You got the full screen.
We need to go on display settings at the top. And just above your presentation slide, it has three options. It has show taskbar, display settings, and end slideshow. And if you click on display settings,
I can't see display settings.
It should be right above. It should be right at your top left. It should have display settings. Oh, and now you're on show taskbar. Just to the right of that is display settings.
Mute, show video, security, participants, chat, polls. Which one do you want?
Oh, your present might be.
Let me come out. I'll stop sharing and try another screen.
Yes. but it did the same thing to me. But because
Is that better?
it is the same. I don't think it really matters. Let's just go ahead, because we can actually see your slides, but we can actually see the follow-up slide as well.
1 minute, we try one more. I've done that one. Let's try that one. Is that any better?
Yes, it is. Perfect.
Right. Anyway, as I said, I'm very excited, especially to have years. So that was why I with the leads, that's, I'm afraid, beyond my capabilities. What I am focusing on is the mandatory energy efficiency standards that were brought in by the government in 2008. So the basis of this is legislation. And I'll try and make it clear when I'm extemporizing with my views and when I'm telling you some legislative facts. Trying to go to the next one. Oh, there we go. So the privately rented sector is a somewhat curious tenure group. First of all, there are multiple individual landlords. We know with local authority and housing associations, social landlords, you've got a lot of housing under one landlord. We know that with individual owner occupiers, we've each got a self-interest in the property that we live in. But what we've got with landlords is neither of those situations. We've got 62% of landlords who only own one rented property, which is about 30% of the whole sector. They're often referred to as legacy landlords. They're people who inherited their mum's home, sort of stuff. 7% of the landlords own 5 or more properties. There are very few who own hundreds. But that's 40% of the dwellings. So you can target some large landlords and deal with a lot of properties, or you have to target a lot of landlords and each deal with one at a time. Expensive, the sort of accommodation that MPs live in when they're away from their constituency. The other end, which the other hump, is what I'm going to be talking about today. It's both lower income and poorer quality. Now, one of the things that I understand, and it's not yet, is that the tax system is pushing landlords out of the privately rented sector and into short-term lets. This is the way in which the government has altered the way the mortgage, the tax relief on mortgage interest. And it's making it less profitable for those landlords, not the legacy landlords usually, but the other landlords who've got their property with a mortgage. So there is some evidence that landlords are selling up, moving out, or converting from privately rented into second homes, Airbnb, etc. So we used to have a situation up to relatively recently where the sector was rapidly growing because of the increased number of households and the failure of the social housing sector to provide rented accommodation. But it could now be shrinking, which could be extremely difficult for people who want to privately rent. And as has been confirmed, There is no national register of privately rented properties or landlords. Means we don't know who we're talking about unless a national survey is undertaken, and then we can't link it back to an address. So there's quite a few differences within the privately rented sector. I just add that the people that are in the high end, the top 10 people in the income group that rent these properties, generally they spend 20% of their income on housing costs. Whereas the people we're talking about today, the poorest 10%, spend about 64%. So housing is an incredibly important component of the week and often property. There is another subsect of the privately rented sector, which is houses in multiple occupation, where more than one household occupies the property. It's often got different legislation, in some cases stronger. So they have to be licensed, so the local authority is involved. They don't need an EPC, an energy performance certificate. If there's no performance certificate, then it's not part of the minimum, I said minimum, I think I mean mandatory. Anyway, minimum energy efficiency standards legislation. I think it's mandatory, I should have written there. So sorry about that. So I'm not going to talk about houses in multiple occupation. They're an immensely complicated but very important part. Okay, here is an energy performance certificate, just to make sure that everybody knows what we're talking about. These have been for some time mandatory on people when they are buying, when they're selling, sorry, or renting a property when you build. Unfortunately, that legislation is very poorly respected. So a lot of people don't know the energy performance certificate of their own home that they're living in, though they should do. And even where it is respected, it's often given rather late in the process by the estate agent or letting agent. So it's not able to influence enough how people make their decisions. But obviously in a desperate market, it's not going to make a lot of difference anyway. So what I really want you to notice is there's an A, which is the best, and then there's G, which is the worst. We know these, and I'm going to be referring to these bands quite a bit in the next few slides. So just as long as you've got some awareness that there's A to G, and that the green ones, A, B, and C, are what most people refer to as the best ones. Just checking I've said everything. In calculations that I've done, in order to get to the standard of zero carbon emissions in the UK by 2050, which is now our legislative requirement, I think every property has to be an A. There are other ways in which it could happen if, for instance, we are all electric and all electricity is from renewables. But actually the energy efficiency, the level of insulation in the property is increasingly important for our carbon commitments. When you get an energy performance certificate, there are recommendations provided as to what could be done, for instance, to take a house from a grade F to a grade E, band A. So anybody who's got an energy performance certificate knows some of the recommendations, the immediate recommendations on how to improve the property. Now for England and Wales, the minimum energy efficiency standard for the privately rented sector has been E from 2020 for all privately rented sector, whether new or existing lettings, and that is in legislation. So we are already in a situation where there should be no Fs and Gs, those bottom two bands. Unfortunately, this is not what has happened. Partly because we don't know who the landlords are, so we don't know who to work with. Just recently, there's been, in the last 2 years, discussion about what follows from the F and Gs. And the consultation was about how to get us all to all the privately rented sector to a C band. The government has answered a parliamentary question on the 20th of October, so less than a month ago, and said, under the government's lead proposed option, it's not yet legislation, landlords would be required to spend up to £10,000 to reach EPC Band C for new tenancies from 1st of April 2025 and all tenancies by 1st of April 2028. So no Ds and Es is coming. So by 2028 onwards, it should be every privately rented sector property should be C or better. It's not, as I said, yet legislation. I don't know what the government's timetable is over this, but they are bringing it in. And there was a discussion as to what the cap should be, and it looks like they're going to fix on £10,000. This is in the context of all housing reaching C standard. So, for instance, the homes that each one of us lives in has to be C standard under the Clean Growth Strategy, which came out in 2017, by 2035. So there are various standards that apply, for instance, to the fuel pool for 2030. There's privately rented sector from 2025, and there's all of us for 2035. So it's different targets for different groups, but it's all happening. These are the most recent statistics that I could find about the number of households in the privately rented sector in England in 2019. Now, the government has introduced a new definition for fuel poverty. It's called LILE, which stands for Low Income, Low Energy Efficiency, and it replaces the LIHC, the LIHAC, which was low income and housing costs. Low income and housing costs. The new LILE definition is that you are in fuel poverty if you're on a low income, same definition of low income, 60% of median income, and you are in a property which is less than a C. So as you can see, from now onwards, you cannot be in fuel poverty in the government statistics under this new definition if you are in an A, B, or C. It's one way of moving everybody up the bands. Now, the majority under this new definition of fuel poor are in the D category. So they're just one band below C, one band before going out of fuel poverty, 18% in E, and 73,000, 6% still in Fs and Gs. And there shouldn't be any because we've had the legislation since 2020 and it's not yet been effective. The 1.2 million households that are fuel poor and in the privately rented sector at the moment is a third of all fuel poor households. So the privately rented sector is very important in terms of fuel poverty and is reason we're talking about it today. Yes, I think that's all I needed to say on that one. Now, this is a government graph that came from the consultation that came out of, I think it was now nearly 2 years ago. And what that does is it says that if you are in a F or G, E or D property, how much money has got to be spent to get you to an EPC C, which is what the legislation requires. This line is the £10,000 cap on landlords. I find this a rather worrying slide But what you can see is if you wanted 90% of the properties, the 75% of fuel poor properties in the privately rented sector that are D, you'd only have, on average, to spend £7,000 to get them up to a C, below the 10,000. So for most landlords who've got D-rated properties, then it's not a lot of money to get them up to C. The equivalent figure, the 90% figure, if you're in an E property, is £15,000. And if somebody is living in an F and G property, it's £22,000 to get that property up to a C. And as we've seen, the government is only expecting landlords to spend £10,000. So only something in the region of a third of those 73,000 households that are F and G and privately rented at the moment would be taken out of that F and G rating at £10,000, which is the most concerning statistic I think that I'm probably going to give you today. If I rephrase that, the people in the most severe fuel poverty are actually going to be helped the least in terms of energy efficiency under this new MEES legislation, if it comes through, which we seem to expect it is. Now, what the government is proposing, and as I keep saying this, and I'll have to keep saying it, I'm assuming this is what's going to be in the legislation based on the original consultation. What the government want is a fabric first approach. They want everybody to get the fabric of the property up to a C standards before a low carbon heating system and air source heat pump is put in. That's extremely sensible, but I suspect it's jolly difficult to enforce. And the recommendations in the EPC that I showed you in EPC earlier, they include recommendations. They're based on cost effectiveness. So those recommendations are a mixture of fabric improvements and a heating system. So therefore, there is the possibility that fabric first is going to be more expensive for the landlord. Now, I want to just say something about the energy performance certificate at the moment. One of the things that we almost all know about it is that the EPC system is somewhat flawed. How flawed depends on your attitude, I think. It isn't a cast iron approach. And if two different assessors went to the same property, they might end up with different assessments and banding. So if we're getting to a situation where a mandatory minimum standard is going to be required, and there will be a fine if you as a landlord, excuse me, if you as a landlord don't give an EPC or you don't improve the property as you're meant to, there is the risk of legal challenges. At the moment, I wouldn't like to see a case based on an EPC going to court, because I think most of us realise it's quite a difficult thing to stand up in court and say, this is the answer. There are new forms of improvements coming forward in terms of standards of energy efficiency. There's a retrofit academy, there's a public standard called PAS 2035, and there's PUSMARK for installers, all of which are helping to improve the caliber of the work undertaken in a property. But at the moment, the energy performance certificate and the whole retrofit standard PAS 2035 approach don't yet work together. So we're entering quite a tricky period in terms of enforcing the legislation coming through. Excuse me. Right. This is favourite little slides that I took in Easington in County Durham. This is a demonstration of how external wall insulation can absolutely, in my mind, improve the calibre of a terrace. There's one house in the middle, as you can see, that's not been dealt with, so that's what they looked like to start with. All the rest of the terrace has got new windows, improved doors, and rather lovely external wall insulation. So they are a great deal warmer. One of the things that worries me somewhat is that the phrase in the legislation is improvements pace reasonably. What the government really means by reasonably practicable, if you go to page 13, you'll see that they actually say external wall insulation may be too expensive if it needs to have a brick finish painted onto it at the end. Well, I totally challenge that it needs a brick finish based on this side. And therefore, my definition of what would be reasonably practicable might well be different from the government's. Right, the legislation in the consultation, and as I expect it to come out fairly shortly, I have no dates, is based on a worst first approach, which means absolutely the focus should be on the F and G properties. They're infinitely the worst. That, to me, means there should be no cap. As I showed you with the slide earlier, and the costs, they could be quite considerable, up to £22,000 to get something to a C. Is it satisfactory to get it to a D? Is it satisfactory just to get it to an E? We don't know what the government's guidance is going to be on this, but at the moment there is a cap and there is a requirement to deal with the worst first, and to me those conflict, particularly because there is still an emphasis in some of the documentation that I've seen that the government expects cost effectiveness to be an important criteria. Unfortunately, most of their judgments about cost effectiveness and the way they calculate it do not include many of the social and health benefits that flow from improving the energy efficiency of a house. So it's a very narrow definition of cost effectiveness, but that could be used to limit the need to spend money on these worst properties. So that's conflict number one. Excuse me. The next anomaly is, as we've said already, there is no database. There's also a little bit of confusion as to what's the difference between a database and a register. In my mind, a register is a requirement and a database is voluntary. The government is mainly talking about a voluntary database. In other words, we will know which are rented properties if the landlord self-identifies. This is a conflict within government between BEIS and the Ministry of Housing. It's the housing people who are responsible for the Ministry of Housing and Communities, Housing and Local Government, I think they're called. They are responsible for the EPC. They want a voluntary database. BEIS want a register. We have to see which minister comes out as strongest. So if there is no list of who the landlords are, how can you enforce this legislation? I have to say I'm totally bemused with the government about this, because I went to a couple of presentations led by government civil servants where the word enforce never crossed their lips. So how you could be bringing forward legislation without knowing how or if you could enforce it is somewhat confusing, if not a dereliction of duty. So are we going to wait on a voluntary database with asking landlords to self-identify, or are we going to depend on local authorities being proactive in some way? Now, coming back a little bit more to you, I'm hoping that the community energy groups that are listening will do some of the following. These are just my suggestions. See what you would find appropriate. Understand very definitely what your local authority is doing and can do. In Oxford, we have a very proactive local authority, Oxford City, and they're doing a lot, and you can rely on them quite a lot to intervene. For instance, is your local authority registering landlords, requiring them to register, and then charging them a fee? Now, it may be a one-off fee and it may be an annual fee, but it largely pays for the provision of the local authority database, register, whichever you call it. Excuse me. And so therefore, there's no extra charge on the local authority, and we know they're all strapped for cash. Do they want you to work with them? What could you do? Do they want you to tell them the name of landlords that you know about? And if you find a landlord, when should you hand over the details to the local authority, and when does it get a little bit tricky? Because the local authority provides a neutral channel, and it's very difficult for the landlord to retaliate and complain if it's the local authority that they're dealing with. It's more difficult than if it's you. There is a thing which I hope most of you know about, called the HHSRS, the Housing Health and Safety Rating System. This is actually a duty on the local authority, but very few of them give it a priority. It is powerful because it requires the local authority to assess accommodation that's rented and not rented, but especially today for rented, and whether it provides a category 1 hazard. Now, that could be narrow staircase, unlit stairs, but a lot of them are unable to keep them adequately warm. It would be fantastic if the local councillors decide to give a financial emphasis to this within their authority and to bring more properties up to standard. Largely it works with the F&Gs, not that it's less powerful with the ones above that. As I've mentioned already, there is some pressure on landlords, partly because of the tax system and the tax changes, but also because of this requirement to spend money. So if the landlord sells, obviously it could go to be a second hand if it's a holiday area, but would the local authority or a housing association be able and prepared to buy that property, improve it and re-let it so that it stays in the rented sector? I do think there's a risk that we're heading towards a diminished privately rented sector in terms of numbers, which could be very worrying for a lot of people. Some other thoughts, as I've said, just get active and understand what is happening locally. What is the trend in terms of people moving, landlords moving out of the sector? What would you do if you found a non-compliant landlord? And if you know a landlord's address because you walk past it every day, you can look up the energy performance certificate on this link that I've given you. It's very easy with a postcode to find the EPC that exists in that area. So you can find out if a landlord has got an EPC and if it's an F or G or wherever it comes on the various bands, so that you know the extent to which action should be taken and if so, what degree of action. I think it's desperately important that the tenant is helped and protected. If a lot of money is spent by the landlord, there's a very substantial risk that the rent will increase. Now, we know with many of the fuel poor that they're cold at the moment. So even if the home becomes more energy efficient, they might be warmer without necessarily reducing their fuel bills. So there wouldn't be any money to pay an extra rent increase from savings on fuel bills. That's preventing a rent increase. I don't know what roles the local authority has. I assume it's mainly government legislation, and I don't know that anyone is looking at that, because it might be registered rents, and that seems to be anathema for Conservative governments. actually talking to the tenant and agreeing, becoming an advocate for the tenant is definitely what I think community energy groups can and should be doing. In lots of cases, they already are on, as Colin was saying, on things like fuel switching. But what about with this legislation? At what point does the landlord tell the tenant what's going to happen? At what extent does the tenant able to say, I'd rather that didn't happen, or I'd rather it didn't happen now? Or is the landlord sometimes going to say to the tenant, you don't want it, do you? It's too much disruption, whereas actually the tenant desperately needs it. So there's a role for a tenant advocate, which I think many community energy groups could do. And even just explaining, this is what a new window would mean. This is what external wall insulation would mean, loft insulation, whatever. I don't know whether there's a risk of the tenant being evicted in order to have the work done, because it can be quite intrusive in some areas. And we've certainly heard some anecdotal evidence that tenants are being asked to leave their properties in order that the landlord can change the use from privately rented to holiday accommodation. There's a big set of questions. What help is there for the tenant if the landlord gets exemptions or does not find the money to upgrade to a C? The household is still in fuel poverty. The landlord has spent up to his cap. What is the government going to do because that household is still in fuel poverty? And I don't actually know of anybody really addressing that situation. Finally, I've got a report. I'll just show it to you here. There you are. I'm not complaining. Oops, can you see it? It was a lovely report. It came out in 1986, written by a lady called Karen Smith, and it was done in conjunction with Age Concern in London. And it was extremely influential on me, and I still think it is an important study. It was just based on conversations with elderly private tenants. The legislation was somewhat different about insured tenancies and everything then. But this is the sort of quote that they found. The room gets very cold in January and February, but I don't want to say anything in case he puts the rent up. I can put up with it. You fear worse elsewhere. So I'm sure, I don't know, because I don't see very many fuel poor tenants. I'm sure that you could find people saying exactly the same thing. Tenants frequently have, especially long-term elderly tenants, have considerable fear of their landlords and saying anything. So if you did a survey of your tenants, especially the elderly and long-term, know what worries them, learn how to help them, and write it up. Please write it up. And keep a track of the costs of being this helping hand, this advocate. Because the government, as we all know, to your detriment, the government does not fund community energy groups to be advocates, to be there to help. You only get money if you're actually undertaking fuel switching and various other things. And you don't automatically get help just to be there to help tenants. So please keep a track of the costs, and maybe one day we'll be able to improve that situation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brenda. That was very informative, and you've got what I love happening. You've got a very lively conversation going on in the chat box while you were talking, which is always a good sign. I think it means what you're saying is very rich. We've got
58.
We've got lots of questions. I want to pass the first question over to Louise Downey. Louise, can you unmute yourself? You asked a question about EPCs. Are you still here, Louise?
Yes, I am.
Great. Can I hand over to you to ask a question? And then after you, it'll be Susan Chappell.
Yeah, sure. The question I wanted to ask, which came up in conversation with another colleague, was that they'd done some EPC training recently, and their trainer explained that an EPC is kind of a measure of financial efficiency for running a home rather than carbon efficiency. So the example that was given by the trainer was that if a landlord wanted to take one action to raise an EPC from G to E, it would be to rip out electric storage heaters and put in a gas heating system, because it would make the property cheaper to heat. And so obviously from a carbon point of view, that doesn't make a lot of sense. So I just wanted to understand whether that was the case, and whether there's the potential for the system to be changed so that it's about making it cheaper and more carbon efficient to heat.
A great question, Louise. Absolutely right. It is an area which is going to become even more important imminently, if not already. The Energy Performance Certificate is based on the SAP rating, or the RD SAP, which is pounds of costs to heat the home and the hot water and fixed lighting. It's pounds per square meter. It is brilliant for the fuel poor, for whom expenditure is such a major issue as a proportion of income or whatever. Electricity is always going to be more expensive than gas, for instance, because it requires a generation station, a wind farm or whatever. So a lot of capital expenditure is involved in providing electricity. The government has made this situation much worse because of various policies like the feed-in tariff for photovoltaics, which are quite substantial amounts of money, and those are paid for by all of us through our electricity bills. 25% of our electricity, the cost of electricity per kilowatt hour, not the standing charge, the cost of electricity per kilowatt hour is environmental and social costs, like the warm home discount as well. The government put it onto the electricity prices because they didn't want to pay for it through the Treasury, because that would put up the government's expenditure, public sector borrowing requirement, it's called. Now, the government could remove that 25% and pass it over to the Treasury today. It would reduce our electricity bills by 25%. Well, not quite 25%, but the energy costs part. There's virtually no environmental costs placed on the gas cost. It's 2% of gas costs. Almost the largest proportion of gas is actually the purchase, which is what we've seen going up so rapidly. Now, there is a very big debate to be had in policy terms, and the fuel poverty lobby needs to decide what it wants. I am at this moment still in favour of the Energy Performance Certificate being based on pounds per square metre. The government is going to have to face up to this sooner rather than later. I was given, I'll give you an example of why. Somebody contacted me the other day. He's got a property that's energy inefficient at the moment. He's going to spend £60,000 on improving its energy efficiency to get it to a band C. He then wants to put in an air source heat pump, but because that is using electricity, and electricity is expensive, the air source heat pump installation would lower his EPC from C to D. So if the government wants, and for climate and carbon, as you quite rightly point out, we do want to move towards more electric heating, somebody's got to do something about the unit price of electricity, and somebody's got to do something about the way the Energy Performance Certificate or an alternative is actually calculated. My preference would be to remove that 25% of social and environmental costs from the electricity unit cost to the Treasury and to keep the EPC as it is. Then we could have air source heat pumps and if we've got night storage heaters, they can keep them. So thank you for the question, Louise. Rather a long answer, but I hope that gives you the information you need.
Yes, that's great. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Brenda. I just have to ask, so before we hand over, I'm just being a bit greedy and taking up this question, because I know that we support fossil fuels. Are you saying that the fossil fuels are supported by the Treasury, but green energy is supported, the green energy support mechanisms come through our fuel bills?
Say that again, Liz Sleeper. Liz,
Yes.
the green energy, what did you say?
Well, green energy is supported through our fuel bills, but my understanding is
sometimes.
Yeah, but my understanding is we do also financially support fossil fuel industry. And are you saying that support comes direct from the Treasury?
I don't understand a lot about the financial subsidies given to the fossil fuel industry. I know they're substantial. I know they still exist. I think they are in the form of tax relief.
Okay.
So it's not money that's given out by the Treasury, it's money that the Treasury does not collect in. And yes, you are right, we need to have a much better balance in policy between what is happening to the fossil fuel industry and what is happening to renewables. The government itself is somewhat muddled on renewables. For instance, the renewable heat incentive is paid for by the Treasury. And as I understand it, the new £5,000 grant that's coming in from April to put in an air source heat pump will also be funded by the Treasury. So there's some consistency would help.
Yes. Okay, thank you. Right, I'm going to hand over to Susan Chappell now, who had a question about flats and mixed dwellings, which I think was also asked by other people in the group. Susan, are you still here? Let's have a look. And if not Susan, I will hand over to Colin. Colin, who else had questions? Oh, Susan is here. Susan, can you mute? Oh, I'll hand over to Colin for now while we try and get hold of Susan.
There was a question by Mark Hinnels. Could we not create a database register very simply by adding tenure to the existing EPC register? I think somebody suggested that this is already the case.
Colin, you faded. I got the fact that Mark is asking a question about adding tenure to the EPC. That would obviously help us identify who's in the property, as long as it's reasonably accurate. The EPC is meant to last, I think, 5 years. I forget if that's the right number of years, but it's not. It is meant to be updated. I did a survey in our road. We've got 52 houses here in North Oxford. I did a survey from that web link that I gave you. And of those houses, half of them hadn't got an EPC, and 4 of the 52 had one that was out of date. There is no system at the moment that I know of that writes to property owners and says to tell them that their EPC is out of date. And that's partly because, and I think I've got this right, that there is no information on the EPC about who owns the property. It's got an address, and I assume it's the person who lives there, but it may be the person that owns it. I'm not absolutely certain who the address is to, but we've got some very muddled, poor quality policy around EPCs.
Thank you. I'm going to hand over to Christabel Watts at the Environment Centre, because Christabel had various comments, and I imagine, oh, she's even got her hand raised. So Christabel, over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to say that tenure type is already on the energy performance certificate. We have done work in all of the local authorities that we work with to download that data from the open data source and find all the F and G rated properties in the different local areas. We know that's not entirely correct, because we know that some just aren't compliant, don't have EPCs, and we know that because you can then sell your property and it changes tenure, but you don't have to update your energy performance certificate, that might be the case. And sometimes, as Brenda said, the energy performance certificate hasn't been correctly filled in, so it could be another type of tenancy rather than a private tenancy. But we've found in the local authorities that we work across, there's hundreds of F&G rated properties, and the real struggle I've had with the work that I've been doing is that there's just no resource in local authorities. They already are hard pushed to try and uphold the HHSRS and the private sector housing teams, and they don't have a resource to take that data. They could cross-reference with council tax data, find out who owns the property, send them all a letter just as a starting point to say, you need to meet this legislation, you need to tell us how you're going to do that, or apply for an exemption. And I think if there was that resource nationally, that would really make a big difference. I know there's been lots of pilot studies over the past couple of years around different ways of enforcing these, in that there's a toolkit coming for local authorities to learn from those pilots. And I think that's all heading in the right direction, because it's a really obvious way of improving the private rented sector. And then you're left with the properties that are really hard to treat, or really difficult landlord situations where actually there's probably more legal things that need to be sorted out there. And as I mentioned in the comments, a lot of the tenants we work with are too scared to report issues or to claim the energy efficiency funding that they're eligible through ECO, because there's uncertainties around their tenancy, they don't want to put their head above the parapet, and they also don't know if they could be evicted or their rents increased. And some of the work we've done with tenants, we have unfortunately seen rents increase as a result of funding that they've only secured because the tenant was eligible. And it's really difficult to put in place terms and conditions to try and prevent that, because it's obviously a whole legal framework and procurement, and someone has to then enforce that as well. So yeah, I think it's a tricky area, but a good starting point would be to enforce MEES.
Thanks, Christabel. All good points.
I just wonder if, Ian Davies, you would like to comment on that. I was wondering if we have local authorities or landlords here who would also like to comment on that. I'll hand over to you first, Ian.
Good morning, everybody. I've worked in local authority for 16 years for Southampton City Council, and I'm now a director of Southampton Renewable Energy Community Benefit Society. That's how we're remembered as CES. We're a political organisation. Southampton swings between Labour, Conservative. Not interested. We're only interested in positive outcomes. And I'm afraid this government has made so many U-turns that it's just, we as community energy need to become a voice now and increase pressure. I put a comment on there that was picked up on the Marmot review in 2010, and that the chief medical officer said that for every £1 spent on energy efficiency saves the NHS 43 pence. This government's continually ignored that. I'm in a grade 2 listed building and we've had no heating for 2 weeks. So thankfully, put in energy efficiency in. I managed to get a grant, which I've communicated to Councillor, some lady Hickman in Lymington, how I got it through the tech centre. And the grant now has to be, all the work has to be done through City Energy, who are based in Cardiff. You can't make a contribution as an individual. So I had started insulation because my wife threatened to divorce me if it was as cold as it was last March in the Beast from the East too. So we're making our way forward, but my view is, and that's why in 2016, I left Southampton City Council to follow my passion for sustainability and to become a voice and to help people who are in fuel poverty, who I've seen in the tower blocks and in social housing. We need to become one voice and push that up to government so that they listen. And the final point I'll make is, having worked in local authority and gone into Whitehall and advised on it was the CRC tax, that's right. Treasury, DfE, NHS, they work in silos. Their departments are next to one another, but rather than go and talk to each other, they'll send each other an email. That's disgraceful in this day and age.
Ian, I'm going to just interrupt you for a moment, because I think we're all, what we really want to do, you're absolutely right, they do work in silos, and it's very difficult to get cross department working, and that is one thing that's needed and has been needed for some time. But what I'd like to do is, one of the...
Can I just reply to a bit of that,
of course,
Liz?
Brenda, of course. I'll mute myself because I know there's noise in the background.
Yes, sorry. I just want to bring up a couple of issues. First of all, the £1 to 43p, Ian is absolutely right. I've never been able to completely confirm it, but I'm pretty certain that you spend £1 on energy efficiency and save 43p in health costs every year. Yeah. So it's not a one-off 43, it's 43p per annum. Secondly, there is another debate beginning to happen, which, and I don't know how this is going to grow, that about the relationship between historic buildings and climate change. As many of us know, a lot of the decisions to protect historic buildings are actually limiting the ability to improve the energy efficiency and reduce carbon emissions. And led by the Grosvenor Estate in London, a debate is taking place, which I rather crudely put as, should historic buildings trump climate change, or should climate change trump historic buildings, with all of the implications that that might have, etc. And secondly, somebody was going to try and ask a question about flats and social housing earlier. Just to say, with social housing, we used to have a decent home standard, which I call decent home standard 1. We desperately need a decent home standards 2, which is very substantially based on this approach to EPCs. And one of the very interesting things for me about the decent home standards, which the government required local authorities to implement 100%, was no reasonably practicable cop-out for social landlords, whereas there is this cop-out for private landlords. So I would like us to do that. Liz, I'll leave it up to you and decide on the next question.
Hi, this is Colin this time because Liz's connection is so good. David Seabrook had a question. David, are you still online, and can you ask your question about the accuracy of EPC ratings?
Yes, hi. Yeah, I've just been looking at the EPC ratings with that link you gave us earlier for the block of flats I live in. They vary drastically from C at best down to E. The flats are all much the same. They were all built in the 60s. It questions how accurate they are. When I look at the detail of some of them, there are an awful lot of assumptions made by the different providers. So there seems to be a lack of standardization and training.
David, I'm sorry, I didn't hear all that question, but the EPCs in a block of flats will always vary. The heat loss is strongly determined by the number of external walls you've got. So if you are in a top corner of a block of flats and you've got a roof and at least 2 sides exposed to the outside air, you are one of the least energy efficient properties. Whereas if you are a flat in the middle of the block, so you don't have a roof, you're not in touch with the ground, and you've only got one external surface, you will definitely have a much better EPC. And this is the pure physics of a block of flats. Whether there are also variations because people have used different assessors and each assessor has some idiosyncrasies of its own, I suspect that's in there too, but some of it has to be because of the physics of the building.
Yeah, that's why I only chose the flats that were the same.
David, I can barely hear you. Can you just speak a little more clearly?
Yeah, that is why I only chose the flats that are the same as mine to compare. Well, not working, is it?
Okay, Colin, maybe we can have the next question.
Peter asked a question. Peter, I have the name here as Peter England, is that correct? Asked a question about landlord database and register. Peter, can you ask your question, please? And David, can you mute yourself, and Ian as well in the meantime?
Hi, Brenda. Yeah, is there a campaign or a government directive for landlords to register, a national campaign? Because by putting that register and linking it with the EPC data, you will find you would obviously get your data for those properties that are lower than F and G. It seems to be a no-brainer to me to actually, you know, force that to go through. But I'm a landlord and I don't know of a database that, and I would register. Yeah, it's the first time I've heard that. You know, is there a campaign to generate a register?
Not that I know of, only through groups like community energy groups, maybe local authority groups. I don't know, Peter. I mean, it is a no-brainer, but of course, what happens is the good landlords, let's assume you're one of those, will self-identify if there is the requirement to or opportunity to, whereas the landlords that are least attractive will not. And one of the difficulties is how you find those that are already possibly not complying with the law. They're not issuing EPCs when they rent out a property. They're not trying to improve them. That's the most difficult bit. And of course, some of them are getting exemptions because they cannot afford the cap, etc., etc. So yes, we need a register, and yes, we need it as a requirement. At the moment, I would suspect that it's up to your local authority what is happening. If there is a group that, I mean, it was a bit what Christabel was saying just now. If there is a group that wants to get more proactive in this area, you can do some rather tortuous things. So for instance, if in the electoral register, there's a lot of people at an address, and that changes from one year to the next. You can assume there's a certain amount of churn, and that's the tenants moving in and out. If meanwhile on the council tax register, it's one name consistently throughout, that implies the name is the landlord. But even if you've got a name, you've not always got an address. So, and sometimes tenants don't even know the address of the landlord. So there's a lot of issues in here, and I think good landlords ought really to be doing something to bring this forward, because otherwise we're going to get landlords giving them even worse reputation.
I would have thought HMRC would have had a list of landlords, because you do fill in on your tax return.
I know, Peter, but there's a thing called data protection, isn't there? What is it, GDPR or something? So the income tax people are not allowed to talk to the housing people.
Oh, right, okay. Thank you.
Right, we've had a flood of questions coming in, so can I please ask people to stop asking questions now, because we'd also like to wrap up. But can I pass over to Susan Chappell again? She's 2 questions, and then we'll move to Bob and finally to Richard. So Susan, please.
Thank you. Yeah, I primarily work in Richmond Borough. We're moving out towards Wandsworth, but a lot of our privately owned properties are in blocks which are a mix of owner-occupiers and owner-occupiers who have decided to become landlords. And one of the biggest issues that we've found is that there are landlords and tenants who want to make external changes, for example, double glazing, wall insulation, but are not able to, because the rest of the freeholders who may live in their property and be quite happy won't give permission or won't sign up to it. And my particular issue is, I'm thinking of one I had last year where the rating was an E and they were desperate. The landlord was desperate to get it up to a C, but were unable to do so. And I just wondered if there was anything
specific that you could suggest, where you've got a really good landlord, not where you've got a difficult one, but where the landlord actually wants to do the right thing?
Susan, there's no easy answer. Right to buy has caused us all sorts of problems like this. And this is especially true if what you've got is a block of flats with any form of cavity wall insulation, because there's a risk if you put it in one, it slips down to the one below. This actually is a problem that's rife within Eastern Europe, and the best solution that they've found, and obviously it's not a short-term solution, is effectively to get a tenants association, a landlords association, a housing association type approach to the various properties. And so that they all work together. There's quite often a communal fund so that everybody contributes to roof repairs and things like that, and to build on that, and just to get them talking to each other, because in some cases you'll never make progress unless they all agree. And I don't think I know of any legislative or legal situation where that's not true. It might be that some local authorities or some tenants association or some legal group have taken some landlords to court, but I don't know. Sorry, I can't be more helpful.
Oh, thank you very much.
Bob from Overton, please, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. There was a slide earlier on, I think it was one of Colin's, that mentioned that 7% of landlords in this country own about 40% of the rental housing stock. Are you aware of any political lobbying to push back against any form of registration or database?
I'm not aware of it, but I expect it to be happening. I think that landlords, I don't know if there's anybody representing one of the associations of landlords on this Zoom, but some landlords are very strongly opposed to any intervention whatsoever.
Yeah, it doesn't surprise me. Oh, and by the way, I am a one property landlord, and I echo the sentiments of my fellow landlords. I think I try and do the right thing, but and I have a property which is not going to be too difficult to upgrade to any future legislation. But I think, yeah, it's such a varied picture. Thanks so much.
The one thing I would add, I think I mentioned it in the slides, I'm not sure if I actually said it. There is a fine for non-compliance, and previously that was 5,000 quid. And now what with the cap going up to 10,000, then you avoid 10,000 and pay 5,000. So that was a not sensible situation. The fine is now going to go up from 2025, and I forget if it's going to be 25,000 or 30,000. So the fine on non-compliant landlords is getting to be significant. But somebody's got to point out that they're non-compliant.
Okay, so Richard, please, from Energize Sussex Coast, your question.
Brenda, hi. I just had a technical question, actually. I hope someone on the chat could answer it. But some of the most vulnerable clients we see are from the food banks, and they're often living in temporary emergency accommodation rented by local authorities. The energy efficiency standards of those properties are appalling. I just wondered, is there a separate category for temporary housing? Does it not have to comply? But my bigger question was, we haven't really covered the solutions that are available at the moment. And there are tranches of funding called LAD2, LAD3 and HUG that energy hubs and local authorities now have access to, but very limited time windows to identify eligible households and deliver the funds. How do you see that working out? Because, how does a local authority, if it has, say, £300,000 to spend in 3 months on 167 properties in its area, how on earth are they going to identify which of the 167 properties that they need to target, and how are they going to do it if they don't have the resource? So, I mean, it seems that there are solutions, but the on-the-ground work is going to be very complex to put into actual outcomes.
Richard, just dealing with the temporary accommodation, I haven't got a clue. I really don't know what standards apply, but obviously the local authority shouldn't be putting people into something that's substandard, but I suspect quite often they don't have the choice. Over grants, I think there's quite an interesting moral debate. I have always been opposed to the idea of giving grants to landlords because they're better off. By definition, a landlord is better off. They've got equity in a property, probably a second property. They've got their own home as well. So I don't want money that's often come from disadvantaged households, especially if, for instance, it's come through eco or something like that. I don't want it to go to better off households. So there's that set of issues. Having said that, I think it's pretty unfair of the government to say you've got to find £10,000. Not everybody has £10,000 sitting in a bank account waiting to be spent on the energy efficiency of their property. And obviously it would be difficult to get that back, except through large rent increases, which we don't want, or increases in the value of the property, which may or may not happen. So my view is that the government should be introducing a system, possibly through the Green Investment Bank, to offer landlords loans of 10,000, 15,000, 20,000 or whatever, that can be paid back with a very low rate of interest. There is a small government subsidy going into the rate of interest, so that it's not landlords being given capital, but it is landlords being given access to capital at really low rates. I've suggested this to the government, but I've not heard what they think about it.
Great idea. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brenda. This has been a fantastic discussion here. We've had some great input, and you've certainly done your very, very best at answering all these questions. A final request by Liz is that we would like to invite people to comment on what they're taking away from the session. Please post it into the chat. You can also save the chat by clicking the three little dots that you can see on the right-hand side of the chat, and there you have the option to save the chat on your computer, including all the links and everything, which will be a useful resource moving forward. So can I please invite you all to thank Brenda for her wonderful contribution today, to Liz for organising it, and to Community Energy South for hosting this. So thank you all very much for your input. And I would just leave the chat open for a couple of minutes so you can provide your takeaway comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you to Avesco and CES for giving me the opportunity to talk to you all, and good luck.
And on behalf of CES, thank you for joining us. It's been fantastic. Thank you ever so much. I hope everyone's got lots to take away from that.